Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Christina and I'm the events coordinator here at Books Are Magic. We're ready to get started. Thank you. Before we get started, I wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's going to go. We'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of questions to ask now. After the talk tonight, Lydia will be signing and personalizing books at the desk near where you checked in. We also have additional books available to purchase from my colleagues at the register. If you're joining us virtually on the live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Mobility Online using the link in the live stream description. It's my pleasure to introduce you all tonight to Mobility, a truly gripping coming-of-age story about navigating a world of corporate greed that's both laugh-out-loud funny and politically incisive. Lydia Kiesling masterfully explores American forms of complicity and inertia, moving between the local and the global, the personal and the political, and using fiction's singular power to illuminate a life shaped by its context. Lydia Kiesling is the author of The Golden State, a highly awarded debut. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker Online, and The Cut, among other outlets. She lives in Portland, Oregon. Lydia will be joined in conversation tonight by Ismail Muhammad. Ismail Muhammad is a story editor at the New York Times Magazine. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Book Forum, and other venues. Let's all give a very warm welcome to Lydia and Ismail.
Get onto the stool now. This is always traumatic.
Sorry about the door.
We did not do that. Hi. Hi.
Hi, good to see you.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming. This is an amazing crowd. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I haven't seen Lydia in 2 years, I think. Somewhere in Northern California on a playground we met.
With McDonald's.
Right, in the middle of the pandemic. So it's very good to see her again. If you all can't hear me in the back, just let me know, raise your hand for me so I can adjust. We're gonna begin with a reading.
Yes, I don't think there's anything you need to know. So the main character of this book is named Bunny, and she has recently, as of this part of the book, gone from being a temp at an engineering company that like builds dams and nuclear power plants, and her boss, who's kind of become her mentor, is joining his wife's small family-owned oil and gas company, and he wants to bring Bunny over with him, and she has agreed. And so today they are going to Houston from Beaumont, where they live, and are going to inaugurate this new venture. 2 months. Oh, also I should say I should like have a Texas accent for part of this, but I will not insult the people of the great state of Texas by attempting to do that. So just imagine that that's happening. Bunny met Phil in the parking lot of the Turnbridge Oil Company office in Houston to inaugurate his new venture with Frank Turnbridge. Bunny had woken up at 6 to deal with her hair. Phil had chided her once for her wet hair at the Miles office. "My mother always said we'd catch cold like that," he had said. When it was dry, she got an iced coffee at the drive-thru and drove like a maniac into Houston, to a place called the Energy Corridor, where Turnbridge occupied a short but substantial tower among buildings bearing the logos of companies she recognized. Bunny wore black slacks, a cream blouse from Ann Taylor, and camel Stuart Weitzman heels she had gotten on sale. She wore a plummy lip gloss from Sephora. She had a fresh notebook and a set of pens tucked into an aging Longchamp tote, which she had bought in college and spot cleaned with a toothbrush the night before. She arrived 30 minutes early out of nerves and sat on a bench near the entrance waiting for Phil. When he stepped out of his car, a Mercedes E-Class, he looked her over. "Well, this is a transformation," he said, which made her feel embarrassed but proud of the efforts she had made. She smelled the faint humidity of herself, the scent wafting from the pomade she had dabbed in her hair to keep it from frizzing. Frank Turnbridge's office was less grand than she had imagined, but it had a view of the other towers of the corridor and was large enough to contain 2 leather couches on either side of an oblong coffee table. They were brought in by a casually dressed white woman of middle age with what Bunny thought of as a mom cut, who introduced herself as Jody. Frank greeted Phil warmly, his hands outstretched, one to clasp Phil's hand and the other to clasp his forearm. "The man of the hour," he said. He was wearing suspenders and a gold class ring. "Frank," said Phil. Bunny marveled at the performance of it all, the way it approximated some old movie about businessmen. 3 other men were shown in, white, not noteworthy to Bunny in any way. These were, she gathered through their introductions to one another, Frank's vice president of something or other, the business broker for Turnbridge, and a lawyer. They all sat down and Frank began to speak. "I don't have to tell you, Phil, what it means to be part of a family company, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because it matters that much to me that everyone knows the gravity of it." Bunny's eyes wandered from his nicely shined shoes, his socks patterned with what appeared to be little bells, his knobby, incongruously thin knees prominent in their neat gray suiting. "I want you to look outside that window," Frank said, bending forward to look at Phil, the business broker, the lawyer, even Bunny, each in turn, extending one hand to the glass to compel them to truly look. They all looked. "You will not find another family oil company, privately owned, on the energy corridor." He kept his hand outstretched and completely still, the ridges of veins on the leathery back of his hand radiating strength. His hands looked rough, as though he himself had wrested the oil from the ground, which Bunny supposed he had. "You will only find a couple in the state of Texas, only a handful in the entire United States of America." His delivery was weighted and his timing flawless. Everyone in the room was still. Frank snapped his hand closed like a dancer and broke his posture, leaning back. He looked at Phil. "You're my son-in-law." He put a hand on the knee of the man beside him. "My son is my CFO," he said. "My daughter is my COO. My grandson is finishing school right now, and he's coming in after. I have another grandchild on deck. I have raised this family in the business, and every decision I make is about legacy, about planning, about keeping them invested in making sure this company lasts another 100 years or more." Phil reached out a hand, facing down, and awkwardly grasped Frank's hand, an almost feminine gesture. Frank looked intently at him. "We don't think in economic cycles. We don't think in election cycles. We don't think in presidential administrations. In this industry, we think in Earth time, geological time. There's no short-term problem we can't wait out, can't think our way through. If," he put his fingers together and jabbed them forward through the air, "if you keep your business organized right." Bunny felt goosebumps on the back of her neck. "When I started this company, we were a trailer outside of Midland and Eileen did the books. She did everything. She ordered the machinery, she fended off our creditors, she drove with me all over hell to find prospects." He took a sip of his coffee. "I watched other private businesses, so-called family businesses, go down in flames because owners make moron decisions or put moron kids in charge before they're ready. They say 30% of family businesses make it to the second generation, and maybe 10% into the third." He looked intently at Phil. Bunny wondered what masculine rituals, what displays of loyalty Phil had participated in to be shepherded into this sanctum after only 5 years. He seemed patently of a different breed than Frank, although which breed was better at doing business, Bunny hadn't the faintest idea. "Now I've got 500 people on my payroll across the state. I am taking care of these people whether oil is $100 a barrel or whether it's $25 a barrel." Frank began to look wrathful. "And not a single one of these," again he pointed out the window, "not BP, not Chevron, not Shell, can say the same thing." He coughed and pounded his chest. They all waited in silence for him to recover himself. "When the going gets tough and they have to stand in front of their shareholders and tell them where their money is, not a single one of them can get through that without slashing their payroll to the bone." He scanned the room to look at everyone's face. "But I don't have shareholders," he said, the anger in his voice faintly at odds with the mirthful curve of his eyebrows. "I have family." He smiled. Bunny felt like clapping. In spite of herself, for a moment she believed whatever this man said. She wrote down, "Family. No shareholders, no stocks, geologic time." Thank you. I would have been better with accent.
I was imagining you reading like LBJ. So, I love that passage in particular because it kind of indicates what this novel is, like generically. It's impressive because it's a historical novel that's operating on 3 levels. So you have, it spans, say 30 years, give or take, from like the late 90s into our moment. So it's spanning political time, human time, like Bunny's life, and then also geologic time, the time that Turnbridge thinks he's operating on, but also like actual like geological and like climate time. Can you talk about what it's like to write a historical novel that is juggling those three things simultaneously?
I love the idea of it as a historical novel because I definitely did not think of it in those terms as I was writing. But I think, actually, I saw on Goodreads today, someone was like, I think this novel works best if you think of it as a historical novel. And I was like, thank you, Goodreads reviewer. Yeah, I mean, first I was thinking of it as just like person time. So, and I was using a lot of my own like temporal reference to write the novel. So, Bunny is obviously not me, but a lot of the sort of things she wants to buy, things she has, kinds of weddings she goes to, types of, conversations she has, those are all, things that I can kind of take from my own life. So I was trying to inhabit moments of the past and really kind of remember what I was thinking about, or what kind of like nail polish what color nail polish was popular,
what magazines you were reading as a kid.
Yes, so that was like my form of historical novel. It's kind of like I hadn't read Annie Ernaux at the time, but now I'm like a bandwagoner, and I'm like, I started when I was still in the editing process, I started listening to some of her audiobooks, and I was like, oh, this is what I kind of wanted to do, because she's so good at just sort of pulling in all those references that kind of shape a particular community's like preoccupations and what their dinner table conversations are like. And so I think I was kind of thinking on those terms, but then in order for, like, the book wasn't interesting to me if it was just like, if those things weren't contextualized. And so the way I had to pull back and sort of think like, okay, well, what else was happening at that time? And many of the sort of broader historical reference are very glancingly surfaced in the book, because they are supposed to be kind of filtered through Bunny's perception. So that was another thing I struggled with, was sort of, it's tempting to kind of be like, and at this moment, like, all these things are happening, but Bunny wouldn't see it that way. And it was important to me that she kind of set the terms for what the book shared, I guess. So I did a lot of kind of like trying to weigh how much to put in, and necessarily left a lot of stuff out.
It's really interesting because a lot of Bunny's perspectives on the politics of that time like don't reflect, I think, what we consider to be good politics. So there's an amazing scene where she's reflecting on Occupy and Zuccotti Park, and she's like, basically, they should go get jobs. So I'm curious, like, how you like, why Bunny can be so unrelatable and unlikable sometimes, but also like about I feel like what's so important about her is that she helps you understand the seductiveness of the world that she's in, of this like world that's awash in oil and money. Why create a character who is so easily seduced by things that are so obviously evil?
Well, I think that is a great question. One of the sort of books that inspired me as I was writing, it's not like a one-to-one like match with this book, but it's the novel Oil by Upton Sinclair, and that also has someone named Bunny, although it's a young like a boy who becomes a man, and it's his sort of political journey. It's his kind of political awakening as someone who's like an oil scion, and then like learns from the workers in his father's oil fields about the virtues of socialism. And it's a really effective vehicle for putting in the kind of political preoccupations of Sinclair. I wanted to write something that felt a little, I mean, it's a product of its time, my book, in that it is maybe a little grim and defeated, but I was interested in documenting some of the political currents that I have myself like been part of. I wish that when Occupy was happening, I was like, yeah, I'm getting on a plane, like this is like, I was far away and I was just like, what are they doing? And then now, I see like that was a really meaningful moment, and that a lot of like amazing sort of thought and action has come from that moment. But at the time I was like, I'm trying to find a job. I'm trying to get a boyfriend. I don't like, and there are many moments in my life when I have been the same way. So in a sense, I wanted to kind of chronicle those, and then also sort of stick with that kind, because I think lots of people, I mean, people have all sorts of kind of political awakenings in life, but very often they also don't. I mean, the truism is like people become more conservative as they get older. I think that our generation is like giving the lie to that because it's just so untenable. I'd like to think that, but then again, you see people, it's like so many systems like property ownership or even like driving a car. Once you do them or have them, you are so smoothly brought in line with what they mean, and how they fit into broader systems. And I think I love that in the novel Oil, it's like Bunny becomes this kind of low-key firebrand and like, you know, starts at a socialist school, but that's not what a lot of people do. And it's not, it wouldn't have felt authentic to me to like create a character who was doing that.
It's interesting to like compare the didacticism of like, I mean, any Sinclair novel with like what you're doing here, the kind of like psychologically rich like, exploration of like why it's like why we allow like the world to continue to burn. I think it's really productive in that sense. Have you seen There Will Be Blood? Oh.
I'm mortified to admit this, but I'm doing it. That I have fallen asleep now on 3 occasions, and I see like I am on board. Like when I saw the preview, I was like, yes, and that was before I'd read the novel. And also the novel and the book have like no bearing on each other. They really part ways. Like I think after page 30 or something.
The movie is like much better.
Yeah.
or maybe not.
You know, reasonable people can disagree. I mean, no, the movie is like clearly like an incredible work of art. It's very commanding, like the performances even before, but like it does move very slowly, and I like have little kids, you know, and I just like I sit down and I eventually am like lulled to sleep, and then I wake up at the end and I'm like, oh shit. But I appreciate what I have seen. But I did, as soon as I read the book, I was like, it's concerned with completely different things.
Definitely like inspired by, not based on. If any of you have read the book already, at the back you'll see there's a pretty extensive list of like resources. Importantly, not a bibliography. I think it's more engaged than that. When I got to that to that part of the book, I was immediately reminded of one time when I saw Lydia on campus at Cal back in Berkeley. She was working on an essay for the New Yorker at the time, and she had gone to the library to like take out an enormous stack of books. And that I think about that image of her when I think about her writing this book and researching this book. It's such a deeply researched novel. Can you talk a bit about the process of doing that kind of research, while also like, you know, freelancing, but not allowing that research to, I don't know, like overly determine the direction of the fiction?
I should say about that essay, like that never materialized because I wrote like 5,000 words, got completely bogged down. I literally was like crushed by the pile of books, like literally and figuratively. And so NewYorker.com, I apologize that
It happens to us all.
never materialized. But yeah, I mean, I think so. I have like this kind of works cited section in the book, and it's definitely like defensive, I think, in a lot of ways, because there is this feeling like you can't sort of weigh in on these issues, or I mean, many people don't have that feeling. But I feel like, you know, you should sort of see what other people are thinking and talking about, and what I read so many different kinds of things, and you know, some of them were works of like narrative journalism, which were incredibly helpful. Something that ended up being like the most helpful were like self-published or like independently published memoirs of geologists and engineers. Like there's a few oilmen who have, you know, put their recollections, and they're because they are, I think, essentially like unedited. They have everything in them, and so those were really useful. And then, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of scholars who are working in really interesting kind of like interdisciplinary ways. There are anthologies about like oil work and oil spaces that, I would just take, I didn't understand, lots of what was in them, but I would take like one idea or one line that, became sort of useful. And I think one of the challenges of talking about oil is that it's such a vast kind of complex system, that anything that brought a lot of specificity was helpful. But then also I love there's scholars who just are kind of talking about the ideas that surround fossil fuels. So there's a book called Mineral Rights by a scholar named Bob Johnson that just is like connects like hot yoga class with like the Titanic. And I love people are really thinking in interesting ways about both fossil fuels and like climate change. And so I was kind of reading everything I could get my hands on. Also, like, Playboy did a Women of Enron issue. I bought that off eBay.
Was that before or after the crash?
Oh, it was after. They went and found, I guess, real women who worked for Enron and had them pose and like describe their work, and that's a collector's item that I have. I have to like hide it from my children. Like, what is this? I have like a Soldier of Fortune magazine from 1993 that like was talking about an oil scam. I would argue like at some point I was probably maybe doing too much.
Well, I mean, I think part of the cool thing about your reading practice, like as it relates to just like both you being a reader but also a critic and a novelist, is that you can like find like the one interesting thing in like a 300-page book and then like dilate it into like, appropriate it so that we also see what's interesting about it in a really cool way. Lydia actually did an essay, was this 2021 or 2022? I think for the Times Magazine about a billionaire autobiography, where we were just
that was
like,
last year.
we were just like, can you go read a bunch of like, memoirs by billionaires and come back and tell us like what you think about them. How many did you read?
I mean, that almost killed me. I also have I have a picture of just like a pile of horrible books, the worst books in the world, that I had to read. And yeah, I mean, I probably bought or obtained like 30 books for that. But then, you only use like 4 in the thing.
Like literally, I think the essay is about maybe like 5 books, but she read them all. But that is a special talent of yours, just like directing our attention to what's cool in these texts. One thing about Bunny is that she is also interested in research, I guess, and learning, but only insofar as she is trying to like understand how to be in this world that she wants to be in so badly. There's one scene where she mispronounces the name of an oil exec or maybe an organization.
Schlumberger. She calls it Schlumberger, which is what I thought it was.
That's how it's spelled. And some like finance bro corrects her, and then instead of telling him to screw off, she ruminates on it intensely and like memorizes the pronunciation. And I was just like, in that moment, the book becomes a novel about like aesthetic education, almost just like learning the right way to be in the world. I'm reading this novel right now called The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst. It's a novel about like trying to like understand how to live in a particular way in like a particular class setting, but that world is like very beautiful. It's like the world of like dukes and duchesses in London, and this world is like it's like Texan oil.
Perspective.
Can you talk a bit about like why Bunny finds that world so interesting or so beautiful?
That's such a great question. So I think, the book starts with Bunny as a teenage girl. So she's 15 and she's living in Azerbaijan. Her father is posted there with the Foreign Service. So it's like an unfamiliar place to her. And notably at that time, Azerbaijan was like flooded with expats of different varieties who were feverishly trying to wrest as much control of the Caspian oil reserves as they could. But crucially, she also is going to a U.S. boarding school because the federal government pays for it, which they will do if your family is posted to some place where there's not like an international school. And so I think that's where her sort of, I mean, teenage girls are natural sort of like sociologists and acute observers. I mean, some, not all teenage girls, but many, are really noticing everything and really, because especially if you have a desire to fit in, that's how you do that. So, she shows you see her like reading magazines and like dog-earing pages of things that she wants to get, and she notices what her classmates, what are the bags that they have, what are the shoes, so she has sort of that view, but then she also has a characteristic that of a sort of like chameleon aspect, which I think lots of people who have moved a lot in childhood have. I have it myself, and it's something that I have sort of seen. I can look back like with alarm at it, where basically whatever like the loudest group in the room is, like she will try and align herself with them. And it doesn't, even if she has the sort of good sense or some sense to see this isn't like, when she's working in, this office park in Texas, and like has nothing in common with her coworkers, and they're like going to Olive Garden, and that's not something that's in her wheelhouse. But so she sees, okay, well, who's powerful in this dynamic? It's not like my fellow women in the admin pool, it's like these awful men. But she's whatever the like group is in charge, she will find a way to ally herself with them. And so in other contexts, when she she meets someone who has perhaps better politics, she's attracted by that person also, but because that's not her sort of everyday context, that's not what she sort of decides to pursue. So I think that's sort of to me, like the tragedy of Bunny is that she is very malleable, and very observant, but she uses her powers of perception to sort of elevate herself in whatever, like, perhaps not worthwhile milieu she finds herself in.
And most often it's like the people she's attracted to or like kind of pulled towards are like the loudest men in the room, right? It's like very, very rare that she like finds a woman who she wants to emulate, although one does enter the fray eventually. Can you just talk a bit about like Bunny's relationship with men and like the nature of her desire?
She loves men, but she also, I think, like perhaps many people, I don't know, I keep saying like many people, like this could be like 4 people, I know there are dozens of us. I think she conflates power and desire in a way that gets like muddled up with other things. So, when she's a teenager, the first scene of the book is she's finally seeing some younger men who are like almost her age peers, but crucially not. They are crucially adults, not teenagers. But she feels like they're almost recognizable to her as people who are sort of older versions of the, floppy-haired boys she goes to this elite high school with. And she's so compelled by them. And part of that is just sort of like sexual interest. They're like cute, and she, wants to make out with boys. But then also they just have this sort of innate authority, and sense of belonging and ability to move through the world that I think is very attractive to her. And her sort of like crucial mistake that she makes at a young age is that all of those things get sort of bound up together. And so there's almost, when she does go into this office environment that is like, it's not sexy, but she finds a way to, because sort of the power element of it, and she sees that if she were able to, kind of pull herself up the ladder, so to speak, in this new like small oil company that she goes to work for, she has a chance to like go places. She has a chance to organize events and sort of have control over her own small like plot of professional land, so to speak. And that's something that she really has like a strong desire for, which gets, again, like muddled up with other kinds of like with other desire.
Despite the fact that like there are interactions with men in the novel that have like the quality of being like it's like you're watching a horror movie, basically. There's one scene at the end of the first section that terrifying. Honestly, I thought that something awful was going to happen to her. Yeah, why that quality of horror?
Well, I know that many people who have been teenage girls have had things happen that were like completely inappropriate, that really exist on a spectrum. But even if you sort of escape adolescence without some sort of like bruising interaction with adult or sometimes peers of your own age, there is just a kind of knife edge of violence and a lot of going about your business. And I hope that's not true anymore. I don't have the sense that it's not, but so it was important to me that was something that Bunny did. Just like the limits of propriety are strained often in the way that people relate to and interact with teenage girls and young women. And yeah, so that's something my husband was reading the book and he was like, I'm scared. And he really picked that up, and I was like, yes, that's
it's palpable. This is kind of an aside, but like the man in that final scene is the dude, Charlie, who's like a war journalist. At least when Bunny first meets him, he's like a wannabe war journalist. Can you talk a bit about like who he's based on and like what his
No. Yes, no, I can. I mean, so everyone is fictional in this book. But I do think, especially as a writer, and if you're like a freelance writer who's like trying to pitch like book reviews to Slate in 2013, and that is like your writing career, that's how you're doing it, which like, God, I'm so grateful. Thank you, Slate, and Dan Coyce for like giving me assignments. But then you see like people who are, 25 and just like starting like blogs and like magazines overseas, perhaps, that are later come under scrutiny, and just having like a lot of kind of freedom out in the world, and I mean, part of that is just like pettiness. Like there's no reason why I, as like a writer, when I was 25, when I was like getting started being a writer, like I too could have like gone and done like big stories, but it just would never have occurred to me. I was always like, well, what, I have to have a job, and like, what is the way that I can write that's sort of adjacent to that? Oh, I'll like read a novel and talk about it in some sort of like quiet way, and then people will make fun of me on the internet for it, And so I do have this kind of like envy, I guess, of the bigness, I get, of that was available to some people as early writers. And of course, like, that can go all sorts of different directions. It doesn't, the media landscape sucks for literally everybody now. There's no like winners. Well, I'm sure there are at some point, but so it's not like everything is great for all writers, but there definitely had that perception that it was really different for some writers at a certain like golden age, perhaps, of media.
Back in the late 90s. So you were writing this like over the last 5 years, partially in California, like during the wildfires, and then in Portland, which is also suffering from wildfires. Just talk a bit for me about what it's like to write a novel about climate change while the story of climate change is like unfolding before you.
Well, I think, part of what the book is about, sort of, and on a meta level too, it's about the kind of romance of fossil fuels, which the most perverse way, but it has many sort of seductive stories, especially for some people, depending on who you are. But it's easy to, like, even sort of doing all this research and thinking about the bigness of the oil complex and all of the stories, and some of the stories are about national sovereignty and self-determination, and they are about people like working very hard and very dangerous, dirty jobs. So it's easy to like feel yourself kind of becoming excited by that. But all of that always has to be tempered by the fact that it is like literally the seeds of our destruction, and has already been the destruction of like many people and communities. So I think it was necessary that like obviously those were checks as I was writing to be like, okay, don't like get too high on your own supply, like reading about these, like imagining these sort of oil people, and somebody who is like, who doesn't step back and say, okay, like nothing short of like actually completely dismantling the system is going to be enough. Because that's what oil and gas companies want you to think, is like, oh well, yeah, it's tough, but like you can't live without them, you know. But yeah, when, you know, the heat dome happened actually right after I had written the final scene, which like does take place in the future, and I had been very resistant to do future casting because I think like a lot of people are doing a much better job of that, and B, I just like didn't want to like get, you know, because that's a huge project, and ultimately takes place, the future casting is like fairly muted in the book. But after I had written the first draft of that, like literally 2 months later, it was the Pacific Northwest heat dome, where I saw like the municipal structures in place like completely shat the bed, where I live in Portland, Oregon, in some very like vivid ways. And then the people who were the most visible presence were like small mutual aid groups who just kind of stepped in and were like, we're doing this. And, you know, so there was like a lot of opportunity to be involved in a way that was very galvanizing and exciting. But also it was completely terrifying to just see how, yeah, the just kind of lack of preparation, which, and so that certainly then like inflected the book. You know, it was like some of that made its way in.
I actually don't think I know what the heat dome was. What was that?
So it was 2 years ago in, I believe, June, and it was it happened all over the Pacific Northwest, so also in like British Columbia, and Oregon and Washington, and hundreds of people died in the overall region. In Portland, I believe it was 68 or 69 people died. Some of the people who died were houseless. Many were housed, but they didn't have air conditioning and they didn't have people checking on them. Some were, you know, lived in buildings that were managed by nonprofits that were just not like doing what they were supposed to. It got to be 116 degrees on the last day. It was a 3-day thing basically in Portland. So it was 116 degrees, but in like the heat island parts of the city, you know, it's like feeling like way hotter than that. And it was really like grim, you know, like people live in their cars in Portland. So, you know, we're going around like just being like, hey, are you okay? And like giving people ice, but the city had cooling centers and then said, okay, they were saying ahead of time, because they really pinpointed with like uncanny precision what it was going to look like days ahead. I was really surprised, like it matched like to the degree basically what the predictions were. And so the city opened cooling centers, but then they're like, okay, call 211 if you need a ride to the cooling center. And so, you know, me and like a lot of other people spent the days before telling people like, hey, this is happening, like call 211. Then on Saturday, like the first sort of big full day of it, it is revealed that 211 is going to like an after hours weekend menu. And it's because the city subcontracts out to a fucking like nonprofit to run this like, you know, city helpline, or the county helpline, and they never told the people who run it, like, oh, actually you need to be on call this weekend because this horrible thing is going to happen. So you're just calling and like getting, and it was such like a profound and like basic fuck up, and you know, there were other things of that nature. And sorry, that was like some municipal ranting. I'm so pissed.
A report from the West Coast. How are we doing on time?
I think.
Well, one last question about like place in the novel. So the novel's kind of like split between Baku in the beginning, then Beaumont, Texas, and Houston, Texas, and a few other places. Can you talk about like what it's like to write about place from the perspective of somebody who is like a diplomat brat?
So I think that how I grew up really profoundly affects how I interact with places. My first book is about a place that I knew intimately, but only as a visitor, and it really sort of imprinted on me. And the reason that I wanted to put it in a book is because I realized when my grandparents died that I had no reason anymore to go to this place, and so it was sort of like reckoning with that. And I felt also, because I was unused to writing fiction, I felt very tied to like, I have to describe only rooms that I've been in, like, oh, this is the fucking street that I walked on, and it was like thinly veiled. I gave it a different name, but it was like immediately recognizable to anyone who's been in that town. But with this book, I didn't want to do that. I really wanted to like stretch and try to write about places that I hadn't necessarily been, with the knowledge that I would need to go to the places. So some of the places, I had not been to Baku before I finished the first draft, and then I went after. But I definitely, one thing that I learned from talking to people who had grown up there is that it's a completely different city before and after the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline was built and the oil started flowing like 2005, 2006. So all this like really fanciful architecture is there now, and all these like mega architectural firms have come and done these huge things, and there's like tremendous oil wealth that flows to the regime there. And so I wasn't able, the temporal sort of difference was something that I had to really like work hard to get, but was compelling to me because everywhere I go is like some place I haven't been, and like if I go back again, I haven't, it's like I haven't been there in 10 years or 15 years. And my dad lives in Greece, where I lived when I was a kid, and when I go back, I'm like, oh, this is so different than, I mean, everyone has this experience. You go to some place you haven't been, but I definitely feel like very strong, like even places I haven't been for very long, I'm like, well, I gotta like hold on really tight to this place. But then also once I go, I'm like, well, I'm done. But I don't want to do that. I want to like, we lived in San Francisco for a long time, and I really wanted to like live there, and but it was just too expensive, and so we moved. And my husband reminded me that there was a time when he had once said like, oh, when we first started dating, he's like, I want to have a job. I want to get a job where I have that job for at least 5 years. And I started crying because I was like, that is so long. Stay somewhere for 5 years. But now that's like, the older I get, that's all I want to do. But I still like want to go to different places. I want to visit places in my mind. That was a very long answer, sorry.
When you'll go back to California, I hope we'll all go back to California.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll take some questions. Is there a mic? Or so, any questions?
Thanks so much. I loved your first book, and I'm very happy. I'm looking forward to reading your second one, and I'm curious to know how you got from one to the other, because they seem so different in subject and approach, and so I'm just curious to hear if you just wanted to change directions, or what got you from point A to point B.
And I'll just repeat the question.
Oh, thank you.
So Lydia's first book, The Golden State, was about a mother in Northern California, and the question was, how did she go from writing that first book to something that's so different?
Well, I think I also thought that they were so different, and when I first gave a draft to my agent, I was like, you're not gonna believe this is so different, like you're probably not even gonna want to represent this because it's not the same at all. And then she read it and was like, this is recognizably a book by you. It's, has some of the same like qualities, but I mean, I think for me, like novel writing is kind of like processing something from like 5 to 10 years in the past that will not like reveal itself until later, and then you sit down to write. So when I was writing The Golden State, like part of that was just the sort of immediate situation I was in of having a small child and really feeling an urgency to like put that on the page, because it was both like narratively challenging. So it was kind of like, oh, like I could do this, but then also it's just like, I need to talk about this because this is fucked up. And then at the same time, like thinking about this place in California that was so important to me, but also so remote in so many ways from my experience, and just kind of like finding a way to like write through that dissonance. And then I think this book sort of similarly, I mean, it was reaching further back into the past, but I was thinking about growing up in the Foreign Service, and some of the, you know, I have some like nostalgia for that, but also, you know, if you are in a Foreign Service family, you are very like self-consciously like part of believing that like America's a force for good in the world, and that's why you're, you know, moving into all of these places. And then over time you're like, well, America is a force. And then, yeah, so it's kind of like unlearning things that in adulthood and kind of figuring out how to talk about them. And ironically, it's like I talked about them through someone who is in some ways like unlikable, or like, you know, does things that are like unsavory. But that was how I kind of like worked through. It started from one place and then was like, well, this has to be a bigger story. But I did want to retain that specificity of that kind of upbringing and those sort of like feelings she has about place. And I wanted it to just be like enjoyable to read, and, you know, and to like have some description that was hopefully like aesthetically pleasing. So that was sort of how I got to do that.
Lydia knows this, but I gulped down put it on Twitter, so I gulped down the book in about 8 hours last week, so you all are in for a treat. I was going to ask, how did the different strains, not really of the narrative, but of the book in general, come together? You know, did you always know you kind of wanted to take your Foreign Service experience as a kid and put it in a novel? Did you were you reading other books besides Oil about energy, and did those kind of just come together, you know, like that? I mean, what were the different things you borrowed from as you kind of conceived the book?
So the question was, how did the various strains of the novel come together as she was writing it?
I had no idea what I was doing, and I just sort of started with this teenager having these kind of bored moments, noticing things around her, and I at first I just kind of wanted to describe like a little bit of just the weirdness of being of kind of like American expat culture, especially like in the 90s, and sort of embassy culture, and especially as it was starting to like slip away from me, and it's now basically totally foreign to me. But at the time, it's like it's a totalizing way to grow up, because it dictates everything about like where you live. You're moving all the time, like, so that was what I was thinking about. But then I was kind of like, the book can't be just like making fun of like Americans, you know, overseas. Like, what has to happen then? And then I started thinking about work and kind of jobs, and like there was a lot of drifting. I just sort of wrote her in different places and then had to figure out how to weave them together. Some of the books that I was reading from the beginning, sort of alongside, and even a little bit before Oil Books, were books about the War on Terror, because that was another. Like, that period of the 90s, I think, crucially, is a time when America moved from the Cold War to the War on Terror, and 1998 is, like, a pretty kind of pivotal point in that. And I think, like, sort of oil and gas and climate change, it's, like, America's, like, the War on Terror is something that's, like, a crime that's kind of, like, too big for many people to acknowledge happened, and sort of, like, if you do acknowledge it, then everything has to change, and so that's why it is so hard to do that. And so that was another thing that I was thinking about a lot. It really became it was like a sort of subcurrent in the book, but that was a more obvious kind of parallel in the beginning, because it is about sort of like Foreign Service and overseas life.
In the glasses.
That would be me. My goodness. Well, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm so excited to hear that it features yet another protagonist who kind of like drives into a political situation that's even bigger than she could have realized, and kind of like blows it open with her, like stumbles
Bumbling.
into something. And I am wondering how you, especially with all of this, like this intensive research process, like how you then try to, the extent to which you try to like keep the protagonist's awareness of this situation apart from the world you're trying to depict.
How do you maintain a separation between the protagonist's perception and the world that you're trying to depict?
I think that I had a problem with trying to do too much like, this is what the protagonist thinks, like not like the author knows more than the protagonist. But actually my editor who is here tonight, Emily Bell, thank you, Emily. There was a time like in this sort of second revision process where she was like, you're trying to write, you wrote too much stuff in to be like, also because the present keeps catching up, and so I kept writing into the present, and she was like, this feels ponderous, basically, because, so I had to like do work to kind of strip that back, and say, no, what would she think, like what would be clear to her.
Emily?
Emily, you're not allowed
Never
to
ask a question. I should have asked it, but I was, anyway, here I am. And there's a moment when Bunny returns to Azerbaijan, to Baku, as like a professional woman, storyteller for the oil industry. And she's walking through the city and seeing how much it's changed, and she thinks, oh, I should go visit this woman, this couple who lived in the apartment like adjacent to them, who kind of took Bunny under their wing when she was a teenager, and she decides not to, like, go see these people who were really meaningful to her at that time. And I have ideas, but I wonder why, sorry. That was not one of those like comments that's not a question.
No,
It's
no,
a
no.
genuine question.
It was just a really
Answer.
good question. There's a scene in the novel where Bunny, as an oil exec, returns to Baku and has a thought to visit a family that was very dear to her when she was an adolescent, and then she decides not to at that point. Can you talk a bit about why she decides not to?
I mean, that is 100% just my response to, my mom, was like a foreign service spouse, and that came, especially at that time, with like a lot of obligation to like entertain and form community wherever you were for very short periods of time. And also, she would like meet people where we lived and like form close relationships with like neighbors and people from the countries where we lived, and she's so good at kind of keeping in touch and did the work of our family to be sort of the conduit, like many women in many families, but I'm always like, and I think part of it is that sort of once you move on from somewhere, you're like, well, that's, and there's something that just feels so, it's like too hard or like painful to sometimes think about going back and seeing people, even though I would want to see them. And so it's easier to just be like, well, now we're just like drifting on our separate, and my mom would always be like, why? Like, what? Like, go and see them. And so, yeah, that's just straightforwardly like my own weird shit.
There's also a scene earlier in the book where Bunny's like stuck at home in Beaumont with Mary Ellen, her mom, and she's like, all of my peers are like sliding around the world, like working in finance or consulting or whatever, and I'm stuck here in Beaumont, like rooted to a place with my family, and she can't stand it. But it's like a moment where it becomes clear that it's kind of generational, right? Like we do slide between different cities, and we don't like form deep connections necessarily. In that sense, it feels like Bunny is just kind of like a representative of her like cohort, right? Like she just is a millennial.
I'm wondering, I loved how the book has this debate that's happening kind of above Bunny among all these characters who are taking on pieces of the climate debate. I'm wondering, two parts quickly, how you managed to do that and have it still be kind of elegantly woven into the fabric of the book. And then I'm also hoping, a couple of those characters came up, but one didn't, which was, I'm forgetting her name, but Bunny's brother's
Sophie.
Girlfriend, who is so critical, sort of a fucking cold water on Bunny. So I'm hoping maybe you can talk about her a little too.
Yes, so thank you for asking. I'll repeat the question, just about how sorry, I jumped in there. The different kind of strands of the sort of debate, to the extent there is one about climate, and how it's represented by different characters, and one of whom crucially is Bunny's brother's girlfriend, Sophie, who is a freelance environmental journalist. She's also Swedish, and she's beautiful. And she's cool, and so it was important that she be like beautiful and cool so that Bunny would like her and be like compelled by her, because again, like Bunny likes beautiful things in people, and or just, you know, I mean, and Sophie is like engaging, and maybe it's funny, I think of Sophie as like a heroic character, but then like I've had someone was like, I mean, it's like a parody of like annoying leftists. And I'm like, no. So, you know, it's just amazing what different people do with different with the same text. But yeah, Sophie's position is very much that, like, you know, oil and gas companies should be like at, you know, first like requisitioned by the state, and then just like dismantling. I mean, just that she is very aware of what is happening, and is comfortable with. I mean, not comfortable, but like spends her time thinking about the effects of climate change and pointing them out, and, you know, just lives life based on her principles, but is also like sort of human enough to be like, yes, sometimes I fly in an airplane, and yes, as long as like don't let oil and gas companies like dictate the terms of or make, you know, participation in daily life like you basically have to be like a monk to not sort of do it. So I put a lot of like ideas in her mouth, but I also because I think I was hoping that like I mean, it just felt important to me, like I'm writing this book with all these like lies basically, and all these stories that are so easy to tell, like, well, we all need energy, like, well, so we have to have Exxon because otherwise we wouldn't have it, and so someone has to be there to be like, well, no, but yeah, I couldn't write the whole book about her. Thank you.
Well, that was our final question. Thank you all for coming out tonight for those wonderful questions.